Are you tired of endlessly memorizing grammar rules only to freeze when it's time to actually speak? What if I told you there's a better way? A method that works with your brain's natural abilities rather than against them? Welcome to the LMJ English channel, where today we'll explore a revolutionary approach to mastering English grammar without a single flashcard or rulebook in sight. Grammar doesn't have to be your enemy. In fact, your brain is already wired to recognize patterns, the very foundation of language structure. Children around the world master their native language's complex grammar systems without ever opening a textbook. How? Through pattern recognition, the brain's superpower for language acquisition. Before we dive into this fascinating journey of pattern-based grammar learning, make sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss any of our language learning breakthroughs. Your path to effortless English fluency starts right here, right now. The problem with traditional grammar learning. Have you ever spent hours memorizing grammar rules only to draw a complete blank when trying to speak? You're not alone. The traditional approach to grammar learning has failed countless language students worldwide, leaving them frustrated and discouraged despite their best efforts. This conventional method treats grammar as a collection of abstract rules to be memorized rather than patterns to be recognized and internalized naturally. Students diligently study complex tense charts, verb conjugations, and exception lists, yet struggle to apply these rules in real-time conversation. The disconnect between knowing grammar rules and using them fluently creates a painful gap that many learners never bridge. Traditional grammar learning also tends to separate rules from meaningful context, presenting them as isolated concepts, divorced from their natural habitats in conversation and writing. This artificial separation makes it nearly impossible for the brain to form the neural connections necessary for effortless language production. Furthermore, the emphasis on error correction rather than communicative success often damages confidence and creates anxiety around language production. When mistakes become the focus, students develop a fear of speaking that inhibits the very practice they need. The mechanical drills and repetitive exercises commonly used rarely engage the brain's natural learning mechanisms, leaving students with temporary memorization rather than lasting acquisition. This approach fundamentally misunderstands how our brains naturally process language, fighting against our cognitive abilities rather than leveraging them for efficient learning. How our brains naturally process language. Our brains are extraordinary pattern recognition machines that automatically detect regularities in the language we encounter without conscious effort. This remarkable ability operates continuously as we listen and read, silently cataloging how words fit together to create meaning. Children acquire grammar naturally through this pattern recognition process, developing sophisticated internal rules without explicit instruction. They hear thousands of sentence examples and their brains extract the underlying patterns automatically, allowing them to generate new sentences they've never heard before. Neuroscience research confirms that our brains contain specialized neural networks dedicated to pattern analysis and categorization. These networks activate when we encounter language, continuously updating our internal grammar model with each new example. This process involves statistical learning, where frequent patterns become strongly encoded in our neural pathways, while rarer exceptions are flagged for special attention. The brain's pattern recognition extends beyond basic sentence structure to include subtle contextual variations, register differences, and even emotional connotations associated with particular grammar structures. For instance, we unconsciously recognize that past tense narratives create emotional distance or signal completed actions. Our memory systems are optimized for pattern-based learning, with episodic memory recording experiences and procedural memory automating language production. These systems work together seamlessly when we learn through meaningful exposure rather than isolated rules. The brain's preference for meaningful patterns explains why conversations and stories are more effective language learning tools than decontextualized grammar explanations. When grammar appears in compelling contexts with emotional resonance, our brains devote more neural resources to processing and retaining these patterns. Pattern recognition versus traditional grammar teaching. The fundamental difference between Pattern recognition and traditional grammar lies in how knowledge is acquired and stored in the brain. Pattern recognition builds procedural knowledge, the ability to use language automatically without conscious thought, while traditional methods focus on declarative knowledge of explicit rules. Imagine driving a car. Pattern recognition is like learning through practice until driving becomes second nature, while traditional grammar is like memorizing the driver's manual without getting behind the wheel. Traditional grammar teaching typically follows a present practice-produced sequence, where rules are explained first and then practiced in controlled exercises. Pattern recognition reverses this approach, allowing learners to experience language naturally before noticing patterns and eventually producing similar structures themselves. This experience-first approach mirrors how children acquire their native language without formal instruction. Pattern recognition also embraces the brain's preference for meaningful, contextualized learning by embedding grammar in stories, conversations, and authentic materials rather than isolated examples. These rich contexts create multiple memory connections, enhancing retention and recall. Traditional methods often generate analytical knowledge that requires conscious processing to apply, causing the hesitation and mental translation that plague many language learners. Pattern-based learning, however, creates intuitive knowledge that can be accessed instantly in conversation. Research consistently shows that implicit learning through pattern recognition leads to better long-term retention and more natural language production than explicit rule learning. Studies comparing these approaches find that pattern-trained learners maintain their skills longer and transfer them more successfully to new contexts. While traditional grammar teaching may offer quicker initial results for certain structures, pattern recognition ultimately produces more natural fluency and accuracy, especially for complex grammatical features that don't translate directly between languages. Why stories work for grammar learning? Stories represent one of the most powerful vehicles for grammar pattern recognition because they engage multiple brain systems simultaneously. When we follow a narrative, our brains activate not only language centers, but also visual imagery, emotional processing, and personal memory networks. This rich neural activation creates stronger and more diverse memory connections for the grammar patterns embedded within the story. The emotional engagement that stories evoke plays a crucial role in learning effectiveness. Our brains prioritize information with emotional significance, allocating more cognitive resources to processing and storing language patterns that appear in emotionally resonant moments within a narrative. Whether we feel suspense, joy, or empathy for characters, these emotions tag the associated language patterns as important to remember. Stories naturally provide contextual embedding for grammatical structures, showing how grammar serves communication, rather than existing as abstract rules. For instance, a story might repeatedly use past perfect tense to reveal background information, helping learners intuitively grasp when and why this tense appears in natural discourse. The narrative flow creates meaningful connections between grammar forms and specific communicative functions. Stories also offer natural repetition of grammatical patterns without the tedium of mechanical drills. A well-crafted story for language, learners might feature a key grammar pattern throughout the narrative, providing multiple examples within varying contexts. This repetition feels natural rather than forced, maintaining engagement while reinforcing pattern recognition. The temporal sequence in stories particularly supports the learning of verb tenses and aspects, as narratives naturally require shifts between time frames. Characters' dialogue within stories demonstrates how grammar adapts across different registers and relationships, showcasing the flexibility of language patterns in authentic communication. Research in cognitive linguistics confirms that our brains process and retain information more effectively when it appears within coherent narratives rather than disconnected examples, making stories the ideal medium for grammar acquisition. Key techniques for pattern discovery. Effective pattern discovery begins with noticing activities that draw attention to recurring structures without explicitly teaching rules. These activities might include highlighting all instances of a particular pattern in a text using color coding, or having learners sort sentences containing similar grammatical features without explaining why they go together. This guided noticing helps learners develop pattern sensitivity without overwhelming them with terminology. Comparison and contrast exercises further enhance pattern recognition by juxtaposing related grammatical structures to highlight their differences and similarities. For example, presenting pairs of sentences showing present simple versus present continuous usage helps learners discern the subtle distinctions between these tenses. The key is presenting multiple examples side by side rather than explaining abstract rules. Inductive reasoning challenges invite learners to become language detectives, examining several examples of a grammatical pattern and attempting to discover the underlying system themselves. This might involve giving learners a set of sentences containing conditional structures and asking them to determine when each type appears and what meaning it conveys. The process of discovery creates stronger mental connections than being told the rule directly. Pattern mapping activities help visualize grammatical relationships by creating diagrams that show how different elements fit together. For instance, learners might draw arrows connecting pronouns to their antecedents or map out the components of complex sentence structures. These visual representations make abstract grammatical relationships more concrete and memorable. Frequency attention exercises train learners to notice how often certain patterns appear in authentic materials and in which contexts they typically occur. This might involve tracking specific structures while reading a story or listening to a conversation, building awareness of pattern distribution across different text types. Prediction activities leverage the brain's natural tendency to anticipate patterns by having learners guess how sentences will continue based on partial information. For example, providing the beginning of sentences with particular grammatical structures and asking learners to complete them encourages pattern internalization. These techniques all share the common goal of engaging learners actively in the process of pattern discovery, rather than passively receiving grammar explanations. Practice strategies for pattern internalization. Once patterns have been discovered, strategic practice activities help internalize them until they become automatic. Cloze exercises represent one of the most effective techniques, requiring learners to fill in missing elements within pattern frameworks. Unlike traditional gap fills that test memorized rules, pattern-based cloze exercises provide rich context and focus on recurring structures, training the brain to anticipate and complete familiar patterns. For maximum effectiveness, these exercises should present the target pattern multiple times within a coherent text, rather than in isolated sentences. Pattern extension activities challenge learners to expand simple pattern examples into more complex ones, reinforcing pattern flexibility. For instance, learners might start with basic subject-verb-object sentences and gradually add time expressions, adverbials, or dependent clauses while maintaining the core pattern. This practice helps learners understand how patterns can be elaborated while preserving their essential structure. Story creation using identified patterns encourages creative application, asking learners to craft their own narratives, incorporating target grammatical structures. This task shifts patterns from receptive knowledge to productive use, while maintaining the meaningful context that supports natural acquisition. The personal investment in creating original content also enhances memory and engagement. Dialogue building provides interactive pattern practice by having learners construct conversations that naturally incorporate specific grammatical features. This activity bridges the gap between controlled practice and spontaneous communication, preparing learners for real-world language use. Partners can take turns extending dialogues while maintaining targeted patterns. Pattern substitution drills modernize traditional substitution tables by embedding them in meaningful contexts. Learners practice varying elements within pattern frameworks to express different meanings, helping them internalize the pattern's flexibility and constraints. Unlike mechanical drills, these activities maintain connection to communicative purpose. Recording and reflection exercises involve learners recording themselves using target patterns, then listening to identify successful pattern use and areas for improvement. This metacognitive practice builds awareness of their own pattern production and encourages self-correction. Pattern journaling asks learners to maintain logs of new patterns they notice in authentic materials, creating personal references of contextual examples rather than abstract rules. This ongoing documentation builds pattern awareness while encouraging autonomous learning. The role of input in pattern recognition. The quality and quantity of language input fundamentally determine success in pattern-based grammar learning. Our brains require sufficient examples of each pattern to build accurate internal representations and recognize the boundaries of pattern application. Research suggests learners need to encounter grammar patterns dozens or even hundreds of times before they become fully internalized. This repetition requirement underscores the importance of extensive reading and listening in the pattern recognition approach. The input must be comprehensible enough to allow learners to focus on meaning while their brains unconsciously extract grammatical patterns. Material that is too complex diverts cognitive resources to decoding meaning, leaving little capacity for pattern detection. Conversely, overly simplified input may not contain the rich pattern variations needed for robust learning. Stephen Krashen's comprehensible input hypothesis directly applies to pattern recognition, suggesting that optimal learning occurs when input is slightly above the learner's current level. This I+1 approach ensures that learners can understand enough to maintain engagement while still encountering new patterns to acquire. Input variety plays a crucial role in developing pattern flexibility. Exposure to diverse sources, fiction and non-fiction texts, conversations, news reports, podcasts, videos, helps learners recognize how patterns adapt across different contexts and registers. Without this variety, learners may develop overly rigid pattern understanding. Meaningful engagement with content enhances pattern detection by activating deeper processing networks in the brain. When learners are genuinely interested in what they're reading or listening to, their attention naturally focuses on meaning while allowing unconscious pattern processing to occur efficiently. This explains why compelling, emotionally resonant content accelerates pattern acquisition. Frequency distribution within input materials significantly impacts which patterns are acquired first. Naturally occurring language contains some patterns, much more frequently than others, and learners typically acquire these high-frequency patterns earlier. Well-designed learning materials should reflect natural frequency distributions while ensuring sufficient exposure to important but less common patterns. The spacing of pattern encounters also affects acquisition, with distributed exposure over time proving more effective than concentrated exposure. This spaced repetition principle suggests that revisiting patterns across days and weeks leads to better long-term retention than intensive study in a single session. From pattern recognition to grammar intuition. The ultimate goal of pattern-based grammar learning is developing grammatical intuition, that confident feeling of knowing what sounds right without consulting rules. This intuition represents the brain's successful internalization of language patterns to the point where they operate below conscious awareness, similar to how native speakers use grammar automatically. The journey from conscious pattern recognition to unconscious intuition follows a predictable progression. Initially, learners notice patterns explicitly and may need to pause and think before applying them. With continued exposure and practice, processing becomes faster and requires less conscious attention. Eventually, patterns become fully automated, accessible for immediate use in spontaneous communication without deliberate thought. Several signs indicate growing grammatical intuition in language learners. They begin to sense when something sounds wrong even before they can explain why, demonstrating that their brains have internalized pattern constraints. They start catching their own errors immediately after making them, showing that their monitoring system is becoming more sophisticated. Their language production becomes more fluid, with fewer hesitations for grammar consideration. They begin experimenting with creative pattern applications not explicitly taught, revealing deeper pattern understanding. The development of grammar intuition eliminates the need for constant rule consultation, freeing cognitive resources for higher-level aspects of communication like message planning and social considerations. This shift from rule-governed production to intuitive usage marks The transition from language student to language user. Neurologically, this progression reflects changes in how the brain processes language, with activity gradually shifting from declarative memory systems in the frontal cortex to procedural memory systems in the basal ganglia. These procedural systems operate more quickly and automatically, supporting fluent language production. Social interaction particularly accelerates intuition development by providing immediate feedback on pattern usage in authentic contexts. Conversation partners naturally signal understanding or confusion, helping learners refine their internal grammar models without explicit correction. Mental rehearsal and inner speech also contribute to intuition building as learners silently practice patterns during daily activities, strengthening neural pathways even outside formal study time. This transition to intuitive grammar knowledge represents language acquisition in its truest sense, moving beyond conscious learning to unconscious mastery. Real-world application of pattern-based grammar. The true test of pattern-based grammar acquisition appears in spontaneous communication situations where there's no time for rule consultation. In these high-pressure moments, pattern-trained learners demonstrate significant advantages over those who relied on traditional rule memorization. Their grammar production flows more naturally because patterns have been stored in procedural memory systems that operate automatically rather than requiring conscious retrieval of declarative knowledge. This procedural memory access allows pattern-trained learners to maintain conversation speed without the hesitations and mental translation that typically plague traditional learners. The transfer from controlled practice to spontaneous use happens more smoothly when learners have internalized patterns through meaningful contexts rather than abstract rules. When grammar patterns have been encountered and practiced within stories, conversations, and authentic materials, they become associated with specific communicative purposes. This connection between form and function facilitates appropriate pattern selection in real communication. Pattern mastery builds confidence by reducing the cognitive load of grammar monitoring during conversation. When learners trust their intuitive sense of correctness, they can focus on their message rather than its grammatical packaging, leading to more natural expression and greater willingness to participate in target language interactions. This confidence creates a positive feedback loop where increased participation leads to more pattern exposure and practice, accelerating the development of grammatical intuition. Self-correction abilities develop differently in pattern-trained learners compared to rule-trained learners. While rule-trained learners may struggle to identify exactly which rule they've violated when something sounds wrong, pattern-trained learners often recognize pattern mismatches immediately based on their sense of what sounds natural. Their corrections tend to involve substituting whole pattern units rather than making isolated grammatical adjustments, reflecting how patterns are stored as integrated chunks in memory. The long-term stability of pattern-based grammar knowledge exceeds that of rule-based knowledge, with pattern-trained learners maintaining their skills better during periods without language practice. This stability stems from the deeper neural encoding created by learning grammar through meaningful experiences rather than abstract concepts. When grammar patterns have been acquired through stories and authentic communication, they remain accessible even after significant time has passed. Common grammar patterns in English. English sentence structure revolves around several fundamental patterns that serve as frameworks for countless variations. The subject-verb-object pattern forms the backbone of English declarative sentences, appearing in simple statements like, "She reads books," and expanding to accommodate additional elements while maintaining its essential structure. The subject-verb complement pattern supports sentences where the subject is described or identified rather than performing an action on an object, as in, "She is intelligent," or "He became president." Understanding these core patterns helps learners construct basic sentences confidently before attempting more complex structures. Question formation in English follows predictable patterns that can be recognized and internalized without memorizing transformation rules. Yes-no questions typically invert the subject, and auxiliary verb, "she can swim" becomes "can she swim?" while information questions place question words at the beginning, followed by this same inversion. Where can she swim? When auxiliary verbs are absent in affirmative statements, the auxiliary do enters the pattern for questions. She swims becomes does she swim. Recognizing these patterns allows learners to form questions intuitively, rather than through mechanical rule application. Negative statement patterns similarly follow consistent structures involving the placement of not after auxiliaries. She cannot swim, or the introduction of do not when no auxiliary exists in the affirmative form. She swims becomes she does not swim. These negation patterns remain consistent across tenses once the auxiliary verb pattern is recognized. Verb-tense patterns in English narratives reveal systematic relationships between time and aspect. Present simple verbs typically indicate habitual actions or general truths. He works at a bank. While present continuous forms signal actions in progress at the moment of speaking. He is working late tonight. Past tense narrative patterns use simple past for sequential main events. He arrived, found the door locked and called the manager, and past perfect for prior events. He had forgotten his key. Recognizing these narrative tense patterns helps learners understand when to use each form based on contextual relationships rather than isolated rules. Conditional sentence patterns express different relationships between conditions and results through consistent verb-tense combinations. Real possibility conditionals pair present tense conditions with future results. If it rains, we will cancel the picnic, while hypothetical conditionals combine past forms with conditional modals. If I had the money, I would buy a house. By encountering these patterns in meaningful contexts, learners develop an intuitive sense of which pattern to use, without memorizing conventional first conditional and second conditional labels. Addressing pattern exceptions. Every language contains irregular patterns that challenge the straightforward application of common structures. Rather than treating these as frustrating exceptions to be memorized, pattern-based learning approaches them as distinctive mini-patterns with their own internal logic. For instance, irregular verbs in English often share sub-patterns, with verbs like swim, swam, swum, ring, rang, rung, and sing, sang, sung following the same vowel change pattern. By grouping these similarities, learners can recognize smaller patterns within the apparent exceptions. Contextual variations in pattern usage present another challenge, as the same grammatical structure may appear differently across various situations. For example, the present simple tense follows different patterns in scientific writing, water boils at 100 degrees, versus casual conversation, I totally love this song, or sports commentary, he shoots, he scores. Exposure to diverse, authentic materials helps learners develop sensitivity to these contextual variations without explicit rule teaching. Ambiguity tolerance represents a crucial skill for pattern-based learners, enabling them to accept temporary uncertainty about pattern, boundaries or exceptions without becoming frustrated. This tolerance develops naturally when learners understand that pattern recognition is an evolving process, rather than an immediate mastery of rigid rules. Frequent exposure gradually clarifies pattern boundaries, even when they initially seem inconsistent. Historical pattern development often explains seemingly arbitrary exceptions in modern English. Understanding that irregular verbs were once regular in older forms of English, following patterns that have since changed, helps learners see exceptions as linguistic fossils rather than random irregularities. This historical perspective transforms frustrating memorization into fascinating language archaeology. Statistical distribution awareness helps learners prioritize their attention to patterns and exceptions based on frequency. High-frequency exceptions warrant more attention than rare ones, and pattern-based learning naturally emphasizes the most commonly encountered forms. This frequency-based approach ensures that learners master the patterns and exceptions most relevant to their communication needs first. Special attention techniques for problematic patterns include creating memorable visualizations, inventing humorous mnemonics, or developing personal associations with challenging exceptions. These techniques supplement pattern recognition by providing additional cognitive hooks for items that resist easy pattern categorization. progression and assessment in pattern learning. Tracking. Progress in pattern-based grammar learning requires different metrics than traditional grammar assessment. Rather than measuring rule knowledge through discrete item tests, pattern learning assessment focuses on the increasing automaticity and accuracy of pattern use in authentic communication. One effective tracking method involves recording spontaneous speech samples at regular intervals and analyzing them for fluent pattern use, reduction in hesitation phenomena, and appropriate pattern selection. The gradual disappearance of pattern errors in written production similarly indicates progress toward internalization. These naturalistic assessments better reflect real language ability than traditional grammar tests. Appropriate feedback on pattern usage emphasizes communicative success rather than technical rule compliance. When providing correction, effective feedback highlights patterns by presenting complete correct models rather than explaining abstract rules. For example, instead of explaining subject-verb agreement rules when a learner says, "She walked to school," a pattern-based response might be, "Oh, she walks to school every day." This recasting reinforces the correct pattern while maintaining the focus on meaningful communication. Progression in pattern learning typically follows a U-shaped development curve where learners initially use some correct forms through memorized chunks, then appear to regress as they begin analyzing and experimenting with patterns before finally achieving stable mastery with consistent, correct usage. Understanding this natural progression helps teachers and learners maintain motivation through the challenging middle phase when performance may temporarily decline. Assessment activities that reflect pattern-based learning include story continuation, tasks where learners extend narratives using established grammar patterns, pattern transformation challenges where they modify texts to fit different contexts while maintaining grammatical accuracy, and communicative tasks that require specific pattern usage without explicitly testing grammar knowledge. Self-assessment tools for pattern learning might include pattern journals, where learners record newly discovered patterns and track their comfort level with each one, confidence scales for using different patterns in spontaneous communication, or pattern spotting logs that document recognition of targeted structures in authentic materials. These metacognitive tools help learners take ownership of their pattern learning journey and develop awareness of their growing grammatical intuition. Progress measurement should also acknowledge the difference between receptive pattern recognition and productive pattern use, understanding that learners typically comprehend patterns in input before they can produce them accurately in output. Pattern recognition in different learning contexts. The pattern recognition approach can be adapted to various learning environments, each with its unique implementation considerations. In classroom settings, teachers can facilitate pattern discovery through guided noticing activities, where students highlight recurring structures in texts and collaboratively discuss the patterns they observe. Interactive storytelling that features target patterns provides engaging context while supporting natural acquisition. Group activities might include pattern hunting competitions, where teams identify as many examples of a specific pattern as possible within authentic materials, or pattern extension games where students take turns adding to pattern-based sentences. For self-study contexts, learners can develop effective pattern recognition habits by maintaining pattern notebooks that document examples encountered in their reading and listening. Audio stories with accompanying texts allow independent learners to hear and see patterns simultaneously, strengthening recognition. Digital flashcard systems can be repurposed for pattern learning by creating cards with contextual pattern examples rather than isolated words or rules. Self-recording and playback help independent learners compare their pattern production with authentic models. Online learning platforms can incorporate pattern recognition principles through intelligent text, highlighting that draws attention to recurring structures, adaptive systems that increase or decrease pattern complexity based on learner recognition accuracy, and social features that allow learners to share pattern discoveries. Visual pattern mapping tools help online learners see grammatical relationships graphically, while spaced repetition systems ensure optimal pattern reinforcement scheduling. Mobile applications support pattern learning through micro-content that presents patterns in brief, engaging formats suitable for on-the-go learning. Pattern recognition games might challenge users to complete pattern-based sentences correctly or identify appropriate patterns for different communication contexts. Location-based features can even trigger relevant language patterns based on the learner's environment, such as restaurant vocabulary and question patterns when near dining establishments. Informal learning situations like language exchanges benefit from pattern-focused conversation prompts that naturally elicit targeted grammatical structures without explicit grammar discussion. Exchange partners can be briefed to use recasting techniques that model correct patterns when errors occur, providing natural feedback within meaningful communication. Social media interaction offers authentic pattern exposure. When learners follow content creators in their target language, with hashtag systems helping learners find content featuring specific language patterns of interest. Transformations in learner attitudes and outcomes. Perhaps the most remarkable effect of pattern-based grammar learning is the transformation in learner attitudes toward grammar itself. Students who previously viewed grammar as a tedious collection of abstract rules to be memorized discover a new perspective when approaching it through pattern recognition. The frustration and anxiety commonly associated with traditional grammar study typically give way to curiosity and engagement as learners begin noticing patterns in authentic materials. This shift from passive rule memorization to active pattern discovery creates a sense of empowerment and ownership over the learning process. Confidence improvements emerge as learners begin trusting their intuitive sense of grammatical correctness, rather than constantly second-guessing themselves against remembered rules. This growing confidence manifests in greater willingness to participate in conversations, reduced hesitation when speaking, and increased complexity in both written and spoken language production. Learners report feeling less mental fatigue during target language communication as grammar processing becomes more automatic through pattern familiarity. Motivation enhancements stem from the visible progress in communicative ability that pattern-based learning produces. Unlike traditional approaches where grammar knowledge often remains separate from practical skills, pattern recognition directly improves actual language use. This tangible connection between learning activities and real-world communication creates stronger motivation to continue engaging with the language. Success stories frequently mention the breakthrough moment when learners first notice themselves understanding or using a complex grammatical pattern without conscious effort. Fluency development through pattern mastery follows a distinctive trajectory compared to rule-based learning. Pattern-trained learners typically demonstrate smoother speech with fewer pauses for grammatical processing, more natural intonation patterns that reflect chunk-based language production, and greater automaticity in adapting patterns to new communication contexts. While their explicitly articulated knowledge of grammar terminology may be less comprehensive than traditionally trained learners, their practical command of grammar in spontaneous communication often surpasses their rule-focused counterparts. Long-term retention success represents another significant advantage, with pattern-based grammar knowledge showing remarkable stability even after periods without regular practice. The deep neural encoding created through meaningful pattern experience appears more resistant to attrition than memorized rule knowledge. Former students report being able to reactivate their language skills quickly after dormant periods, with grammatical patterns returning more readily than vocabulary. This retention advantage stems from the multiple memory systems engaged during pattern-based learning, creating redundant neural pathways that preserve access to grammar knowledge over time. Integrating pattern recognition into language education. The transition from traditional grammar teaching to pattern-based approaches requires thoughtful implementation strategies across educational contexts. For classroom teaching, this shift begins with reframing grammar lessons as pattern discovery sessions rather than rule presentations. Teachers can guide students through pattern noticing in authentic texts, using strategic questions to help learners recognize structural commonalities without immediately providing technical terminology. Classroom activities should sequence exposure before analysis, ensuring learners encounter patterns in meaningful contexts before examining their structure. Visual highlighting techniques help make patterns more salient within texts, while collaborative analysis encourages learners to articulate pattern observations in their own words. Materials development for pattern-based grammar learning requires different design principles than traditional grammar resources. Effective materials present grammar patterns within coherent texts rather than isolated sentences, use natural repetition of target patterns without artificial density, and include visual support for pattern recognition through strategic formatting or color coding. Story-based grammar resources particularly support pattern recognition by embedding target structures within engaging narratives that provide contextual meaning and emotional connection. These materials should balance pattern consistency with authentic language use, avoiding the temptation to create texts so pattern-focused that they sound unnatural. Teacher training needs for implementing pattern-based approaches include developing skills in selecting appropriate input materials, designing effective pattern noticing activities, providing feedback that reinforces patterns rather than explaining rules, and assessing progress through communicative outcomes rather than discrete grammar tests. Professional development should help teachers recognize patterns in language themselves, as many have been trained primarily in rule-based approaches and may need to develop new perspectives on familiar grammar structures. Training should also address common implementation challenges, such as managing learner expectations, particularly for those accustomed to traditional grammar instruction. Curriculum design considerations include determining optimal pattern sequencing based on frequency, complexity, and communicative value rather than traditional grammar syllabi organization. Pattern-based curricula typically integrate grammar more thoroughly with topical content instead of treating it as a separate strand. Assessment systems need redesigning to evaluate pattern recognition and application rather than rule knowledge, potentially including portfolio assessment of pattern use development over time and performance-based tasks that elicit specific patterns. In authentic communication contexts, institutional adoption of pattern-based approaches may face resistance from stakeholders accustomed to traditional grammar teaching, requiring clear articulation of the research basis for pattern recognition, methods and documented success cases demonstrating their effectiveness. Pilot programs with careful outcome measurement can help build support for wider implementation. Beyond patterns, a holistic approach to language. While pattern recognition offers a powerful approach to grammar acquisition, its greatest potential emerges when integrated within a comprehensive language learning framework. Combining pattern recognition with other complementary approaches creates a balanced methodology that addresses all aspects of language development. Strategic integration might pair implicit pattern learning through stories and authentic materials, with occasional explicit discussion of particularly challenging patterns that resist acquisition through exposure alone. This balanced approach recognizes that different grammatical features may benefit from different learning approaches, with some patterns emerging naturally from input, while others require more deliberate attention. The role of explicit knowledge in pattern-based learning remains important for specific situations, particularly for adult learners with analytical learning preferences. Brief explanations that describe patterns rather than prescribing rules can accelerate the pattern recognition process by directing attention to relevant features. Metalinguistic awareness helps learners reflect on their own pattern use and recognize gaps in their internal grammar systems. The key distinction lies in timing. Explanations support most effectively when they follow experience with patterns, rather than preceding it. Vocabulary acquisition and pattern recognition share natural connections, as words typically appear within grammatical patterns that shape their usage. Learning collocations and lexical phrases as patterns themselves helps develop appropriate word usage while simultaneously reinforcing grammatical structures. This lexical approach to grammar recognizes that many seemingly grammar-based choices actually center around specific word combinations and their conventional patterns. Cultural aspects of language intimately connect with grammatical patterns. As different cultures express concepts through distinct grammatical frameworks, honorific systems, gendered language patterns, and directness conventions all reflect cultural values embedded within grammar. Pattern-based learning naturally incorporates these cultural dimensions by presenting grammar within authentic contexts, rather than as abstract systems. Lifelong language development through pattern awareness extends beyond formal study periods, equipping learners with observation skills that continue enriching their language knowledge throughout life. When learners understand language as patterns, rather than rules, they develop ongoing curiosity about language structures they encounter, constantly refining their internal grammar through new input. This perspective transforms everyday language exposure into continuing education opportunities. The ultimate goal transcends mere pattern mastery to achieve communicative competence, the ability to use patterns flexibly and appropriately for effective expression in diverse contexts. Pattern recognition serves this larger purpose by developing the grammatical foundation that supports meaningful communication while maintaining the connection between form and function that gives grammar its purpose. We've journeyed together through the fascinating world of pattern-based grammar learning, discovering how our brains naturally process language and how we can harness this power to master English without the drudgery of memorizing endless rules. The pattern recognition method isn't just another technique, it's a revolution in how we understand language acquisition. As you continue your English learning journey, I encourage you to approach grammar with fresh eyes. Start noticing patterns in everything you read and hear. Let your brain do what it does best, recognize patterns and build intuitive understanding. Remember, children around the world master complex grammar systems without ever opening a grammar book. If you found this approach helpful, please hit that like button and share this video with other English learners who might be struggling with traditional grammar methods. Leave a comment below sharing your own experience with grammar learning. What patterns have you noticed in English that clicked for you? Don't forget to subscribe to the LMJ English channel for more revolutionary language learning content that works with your brain, not against it. Until next time, happy pattern hunting and effortless English learning. Key vocabulary from our story: pattern recognition. Noun. The ability to identify recurring structures or regularities. Example. Pattern recognition is a natural cognitive ability that our brains use when learning languages. Memorization. Noun. The process of committing information to memory through repetition. Example. Traditional grammar teaching relies heavily on memorization of abstract rules. Intuition. Noun. The ability to understand something immediately without conscious reasoning. Example. Developing grammatical intuition allows you to speak correctly without thinking about rules. Acquisition. Noun. The process of gaining knowledge or learning a skill. Example. Language acquisition happens most naturally through meaningful exposure to patterns. Context. Noun. The circumstances that form the setting for an event or statement. Example. Learning grammar in context helps you understand when and why certain patterns are used. Internalize, verb, to make attitudes or behavior part of your nature by learning or unconscious assimilation. Example. The goal is to internalize grammar patterns so they become automatic. Procedural, adjective, relating to an established or official way of doing something. Example. Pattern-based learning creates procedural knowledge that operates automatically. Declarative, adjective, stating or describing something explicitly. Example. Traditional grammar teaching focuses on declarative knowledge of rules. Cognitive, adjective, relating to mental processes of perception, memory, judgment, and reasoning. Example. The pattern recognition method aligns with cognitive processes of natural learning. Immersion. Noun. The state of being deeply engaged or involved in something. Example. Language immersion provides rich exposure to grammar patterns in authentic contexts. Recasting. Noun. Reformulating someone's incorrect utterance with the correct form. Example. Recasting is an effective way to provide pattern-based feedback without interrupting communication. Automaticity. Noun. The ability to do things without occupying the mind with the low-level details. Example. Developing automaticity. With grammar patterns is the goal of pattern-based learning. Exposure. Noun. The state of being in contact with something. Example. Sufficient exposure to language patterns is necessary for the brain to detect regularities. Retention, noun. The is continued possession, use, or control of something. Example. Pattern-based learning leads to better long-term retention of grammar knowledge. Explicit, adjective. Stated clearly and in detail, leaving no room for confusion or doubt. Example. Explicit grammar teaching involves directly explaining rules to students. Implicit, adjective. Implied though not plainly expressed. Example. Implicit learning occurs when students acquire grammar patterns without conscious attention to rules. Fluency, noun. The ability to express oneself easily and articulately. Example. Pattern recognition leads to greater fluency by reducing the need for conscious grammar processing. Close, noun. A language exercise consisting of text with words removed. Example. Close exercises help learners practice completing pattern. Frameworks with appropriate words. Authentic, adjective. Of undisputed origin and not a copy. Genuine. Example. Authentic materials contain natural examples of grammar patterns used in real communication. Metacognitive, adjective. Relating to awareness and understanding of one's own thought processes. Example. Metacognitive strategies help learners become aware of the patterns they're noticing.